Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today I am going to try using Glauber salt as a leveling agent for kettle dyeing for the first time. What is a leveling agent? A leveling agent is something that can help slow down the absorption of colors a little bit so that way you can get more even coverage onto your yarn. But before I talk more about Glauber salt, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Lloyd. Lloyd, thank you so much for being my lab partner and for encouraging me to finally explore Glauber salt, which I purchased a really long time ago and just haven't played with yet. Glauber salt is sodium sulfate, and it is a leveling agent that is really helpful to use with fiber reactive dyes that contain turquoise. It can help the color yield there so you can get brighter colors. And it's also useful as a leveling agent with leveling class acid dyes. There are a lot of different classes of acid dyes, and Dharma Trading Company actually has a lot of good information about that on their website if you want to learn more about the differences. But specifically, the leveling class is where Glauber salt can be helpful for getting a more even color. At least I think that's what it's supposed to do. If you are looking at pre-metallized or milling class acid dyes, for those you would want a different leveling agent, ammonium sulfate, to help achieve that even color. And that's something that I'll try to grab for another video. But I think one of the cool things I read about ammonium sulfate is that it is pretty pH neutral until the temperature goes up, which can be really, really helpful for sort of slowing things down and letting those dyes sort of dissolve and interact with the heat in the yarn, and then letting things turn acidic once you start to get to temp. And so that sounds pretty cool, but that's not what we're dealing with today. Here I have a collection of acid dyes that are either known to break or can be tricky sometimes and give some surprise colors. And then I also brought down Pink Orchid because that strikes really, really fast. And so it's a little hard to get that even sometimes because it does just start striking to the yarn so quickly. You can see that some of our pre-metallized dyes, which are mixtures, do have a P on them already. And I think these colors would be great candidates to try with ammonium sulfate sometime in the future. There are a fair number of leveling class acid dyes on the website. This list also includes lichen, hyacinth, bright aqua, plum dandy, deep purple. There's a number of them. But I picked these two because I know that they break. And so in addition of overall tonal saturation of the color, we could also see if we end up with breaking with these colors. When dealing with fiber reactive dyes, Dharma recommends you use 1 cup of Glauber salt in 1 gallon of water when you're going for solids. And I think there's a similar ratio maybe for tie-dyeing. I forget exactly. But when it comes to acid dyes on wool or silk, they recommend 1 tablespoon per pound of fiber. And I typically don't think about my acid and other things in terms of the amount of fiber I'm dyeing. I tend to think it more in terms of concentration. So I'm not entirely sure what to do with this, but we're gonna give it a shot. Today we are gonna dye some bare Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn, which is 100% Peruvian highland wool. Starting with a non-superwash yarn is both gonna make things a little bit easier and a little bit harder for ourselves. Since dyes absorb slower on non-superwash yarn like this, it is already a little bit easier to get an even coverage. And that's why I decided to try to make things even more challenging by picking colors that break and that sometimes can be tricky. The reason why this is making things harder for ourselves is that since things overall will absorb slower, we may not see as dramatic as a difference as if we had started with something that was superwash. But let's give our first attempt using this Wool of the Andes, and then depending on what we observe, we can move on to something that is superwash. But I have pre-soaked this yarn overnight, so it is really well saturated. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, and measured out 1 teaspoon of the Glauber salt and dissolved it in some hot tap water the best that I could. I decided to start with 1 teaspoon because that's about 1/3 of a tablespoon, and 1 skein of yarn is about 1/4 pound, and so we've got a little bit more Glauber salt than what was recommended, but I figured that that was a decent starter place and one that would be easy to replicate. Then I measured out 1 gram of the tobacco leaf acid dye twice, dissolving each of these grams in an unspecified volume of hot tap water. I measured out the dye by weight twice, so that way if there's any particulates or anything that settle to the bottom, it'll do that in each of the respective cups, and we'll be adding, to the best that we can, the exact same amount of dye to each of our kettles. Finally, I set up my 2 stainless steel dye pots with 8 cups of water and no acid, so then we can set the rest of the things up. Now I'm going to add the dye to each container. I didn't pay attention to the volume that I dissolved the dye into. It's maybe between, I'd say, 1/2 cup and a cup, but I did make sure to do each sample with approximately the same amount of liquid. So that way we could try to keep the conditions in the 2 pots as similar as possible. Now I'm going to add the dye to this other pot. Tobacco leaf is not a color that I've used a ton. I believe I used it once to dip dye colors that break, but I now don't remember. My hope is that it'll absorb a little bit faster than, say, the purple pop will. And so that's why I decided to go with this first, and then maybe we'll try the purple pop. I mean, we'll see what we see and what we observe. I added a little bit more water to this cup, and I'm glad I did, because what's kind of left is a deeper green. That can be kind of the case with some of these trickier colors sometimes, that there can be something that doesn't dissolve quite as quickly or easily. Sometimes it's some yellows. Sometimes I see like a teal at the end, maybe an avocado. So I'm, again, trying to keep these 2 cups as similar as I can as I try to leave no dye behind in the cup. But this kind of color shifting with whatever is left in the cup, that is the big reason why I did not want to measure out 2 grams of dye and then divide it, because then we could see some differences. But overall, I'm kind of excited to see what kind of color we get. Now, before we add the yarn, I am going to add the Glauber salt to this smaller pot. And I'm going to add the same amount of water, about 150 milliliters, to the bigger pot. Again, so we can keep the volume similar, so that way when we go to add acid, we're treating things as similarly as possible. To distinguish between our different skeins of yarn, I added a second little zip tie as a marker to the one that will have the Glauber salt. And then to the other pot, it's just a zip tie. And so now I'm going to add the yarn in. I'm not planning on just we're dip dyeing right now just to sort of treat things as similarly as possible, but I'm not expecting that things will necessarily strike yet because we have no acid, but you never know, and if things were hot, then we could do this. But I think if you're going to use a leveling agent, you're going to want to add your yarn to the dye bath while things are still cold, because part of the whole purpose of the leveling agent is to help you get a little bit more even color coverage. Now, if I wanted to get sort of a true semi-solid with each of these colors, I could have added a lot more water to start with. But I am sort of trying to make things a little bit more challenging, so 8 cups should be fine. Normally we should be able to get a really lovely tonal that way, but with the dye accessing the yarn pretty well all over. I think let's add the acid now before we heat things up. And we're gonna start with, I think, 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. And so we probably, by the time we added the dye and the Glauber salt, have closer to 10 cups of water here. And so this is a proportion where I know a lot of things will strike to our yarn. And once again, I'm sort of stirring and dip dyeing a little bit. As I'm doing this, you can kind of see a little evidence of some breaking that could occur. But by doing this side by side, we can attempt to get things as even as possible. But I know once I go to the stove, the situation will no longer be the same. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But first, I'll go put these on the stove. So with the pot on the stove, our pots are different sizes and the burners are different sizes as well. So one of them may heat up faster than the other, and that's a variable that I cannot really control unless we were to do the dyeing in the same pot, one after the other. But if we were doing that, then I might stir one more than the other, and so thus far I've treated the skeins as similarly as I possibly can. Here is our other pot, and the color is showing up a little bit washed out. I do see potentially some evidence of what could be some breaking on both, but again, we'll see if we see more in one than the other in a little while. I am going to heat these for 30 minutes and then we'll come back and check in and see where we are. But if we start to hit boil, I will reduce the heat so we stay just below a simmer. Depending on what we do or don't see here, we will either try the tobacco leaf on some superwash yarn with and without Glauber salt, or we'll stick with the non-superwash yarn and try purple pop. But that's a color to do second because you usually have to leave that in the pot to let it cool completely for the colors to absorb, and it's a huge bleeder. So yeah, there's parts of it that can strike fast. So I don't know, we'll see. But maybe also we'd start with the pots hot when we add the yarn, just to try to start with conditions that would lead to a less even color to see if we see one that looks more even. I don't know, there's a lot of little variations that we could try. And if you have experience with Glauber salt, please let me know down in the comments, because again, this is my first time trying. I did not do a deep dive into research. I'm mainly going off of the recommendations from Dharma, because honestly, a lot of times when you're gonna try something for the first time, you might see what the supplier where you got the item, you might see what they recommend before going in doing a deep dive. And then if things don't work, you could do a deeper dive. But anyway, that's sort of my approach for this first attempt. But while I have your attention, please make sure you're subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. You can also join to become a channel member and get some fun loyalty badges and custom emotes if you'd like. No pressure. It's been 30 minutes and let's take a look and see. I potentially see some breaking in here. Yes, I see some more red tones and less red tones. And this is the sample with Glauber salt. There's a fair amount of yellow remaining in the pot. And so let's go check on the without Glauber salt, and then we'll decide if we need to add more acid. I haven't tried just regular table salt ooh, this one exhausted completely. I've not tried just table salt with dyeing wool, and so that may help, but I have tried doing speckles with table salt and found that it did cause colors to spread out a little bit more than, say, using sugar or citric acid. So I know that salt can make things spread a bit, but the effects are subtle. Right now, I cannot say if the color feels more or less even here. Ooh, I see some of those greens maybe. Maybe. So I am going to just leave it in the pot. We'll add more acid, I think, to both for good measure. But we do have one difference we see right now, and it's the pot with the Glauber salt has some of that yellow left, whereas the other pot does not. Let's just go ahead and add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar for good measure. And we'll go back to the other pot. Here we are with the Glauber salt, and just to show in contrast, there's a fair amount of yellow left. So things are definitely binding slower. And we're now adding our 2 more tablespoons of white vinegar. We did have to reduce the temperature at some point, and ultimately that's not a lot of color that's left, but the fact that we see a difference between the 2 pots means that maybe what's happening here is slower. So anyway, I set a timer for 20 more minutes, and we will check back in then. Let's see how we're doing. All right, I'm still seeing maybe not as much, but there's definitely still a yellow left here. And we have a lot of acid. So I'm gonna turn off the heat and let this cool off in the pot for, how about 45 minutes? The only reason why I'm limiting it to 45 minutes is that I would like to use these pots to try to dye some yarn with some of the superwash yarn and to see how that goes. And so, yeah, we'll wait 45 minutes and see if the rest of that yellow absorbs or not. And the other pot, I turn off the heat and I'm gonna let that yarn sit in the pot as well so we can treat things similarly. But we already know that all that color cleared. Let's remove this yarn. There's a tiny bit of yellow left, but a lot less than there was before. And I am gonna set this aside in a pan to cool, to finish cooling. It's mostly cool. I don't think the camera is picking up the red notes in this color very well. This is our yarn that did not have any Glauber salt in it. And I am very curious to cool these a little bit more to compare them. All right, here is our yarn that we dyed with no Glauber's salt. And I do think I see a little bit of some tonal variation in here. Like there's some areas that feel like a deeper, almost green, areas that feel lighter. And here is our yarn that we dyed with the Glauber salt. The color between the two is very, very similar. It could be a little too close to call. I mean, I think we see a tiny bit of some breaking in here, and oh, here we have some of that greenish color that I see over there. So I don't know for sure. Because here we have with Glauber salt and without. I mean, yeah, I think it will need to take just a closer look when it's dry, because right now they are looking so similar, and I'm seeing a lot of really lovely dimension in here, but it's still dimension. What we do know for a fact is that some pigments with the Glauber salt did absorb slower overall. So we do have that tiny amount of knowledge here. But as for the rest, let's give this a shot on some superwash yarn, because that should potentially exaggerate some breaking, exaggerate some tonalness, and so, well, we'll see. Instead of moving on to Purple Pop, I thought that we would take a look at tobacco leaf again, but this time using a superwash yarn. Off camera, I measured out 1 gram of the tobacco leaf acid dye twice, dissolved them each in around a cup of water, and then went back to the dye baths that we had used during the Wool of the Andes stage. We already have about 8 cups of water and about 4 tablespoons of white vinegar in here, and one of our pots should still have that Glauber salt in there. I added the dye and then added the yarn, moved the yarn around, and turned on the heat to start heating things up. This time the pots weren't completely cool, but they were somewhere in between room temperature and warm because they had been sitting for a while. I heated the yarn for 30 minutes before checking back in. I did my best to treat the yarn the same as I was adding it, but it's possible that I went a little bit slower or did more dips on one than the other. And so because I wasn't doing them at the exact same time like I did for the original one, potentially we could see variation that is a result of how I added the yarn to the pan. Checking in after 30 minutes, And I'm not really seeing any color left where we don't have the Glauber salt. And we have a fair amount of variation here that didn't really change after I dipped it in. I don't know if I dipped that other one more or not. We had a little bit of yellow left in here when we started, but I still see, I think, a little bit more. So what I'm gonna do from here is I am going to turn off the heat and let all of the yarn cool in these pots for a while, and then once it's cool, we'll wash it. I do see less overall variation here, I think, but I will need to go back and take a little screenshot of what the yarn looked like after I had finished sort of dipping it in to see if that looked substantially different from the other pot. Let's wash the non-superwash yarn. Looking at everything and seeing what's happening on the superwash yarn, I'm not sure how many conclusions I'll be able to make. Certainly, I think it's something that doesn't hurt, but I don't see like a massive dramatic difference. I am very curious, however, to try that ammonium sulfate and to see how that goes with some more of those pre-metallized dyes. But anyway, I saw maybe a hint of yellow, and I'm now going to add some dish soap and fill up this container with water. Okay. Let's see. Awesome. I'm not seeing any bleeding. What's fun is that this is a beautiful yellowy brown color, which isn't always my favorite, but it has just enough red in it. Ooh, this one I'm seeing some real red notes in there. That's the one without the Glauber salt. Am I feeling that? Here, maybe it's a little more even. We'll have to try with other colors or make some blends that we know strike fast. This is just the first look. And a negative result or something that's inconclusive doesn't mean that something isn't worth doing. It just means that I'm maybe not going to say, oh, you have to get Glauber salt. It makes the biggest difference in the world. So clearly I have more playing to do. We should try upping the amount of Glauber salt. Let's see if that makes a difference. But anyway, I'm going to finish rinsing out this soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. So here is the yarn, the superwash yarn that had no Glauber salt. And here is the yarn that did have the Glauber salt in the dye bath. And the dye bath is pretty much clear. There's a little hint of yellow in there. And I think I'm gonna have to look at the dyeing side by side because the color is absolutely more even on the skein that had the Glauber salt, but I don't know if I dipped it in similarly or not. Both of them have the same amount of acid though. But of course, we'll take a closer look when things are dry. I'm gonna add a little bit of dish soap and fill this back up with water.
Ooh, it's soapy.
It is. I probably added a little too much soap. So let's see. We're looking pretty good. I don't think I see any color coming out.
It's leaking. The water is at least.
Though it's leaking water?
Well,
yeah.
The water's coming out of the bucket.
No, I spilled. I don't think I see any bleeding. So I'm going to go ahead and fill up this bucket with water.
That's cool. This water is not soapy.
Well, it is maybe a tiny bit, but it's got a lot less.
Yeah.
But
you can't really see much soap.
Yeah, but that's looking clear to me. So I think I'll just rinse it one more time to get the rest of the soap out, and then I'll put the yarn in my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. We're gonna start looking at our superwash yarn because I do see a difference here. And I'm gonna have to take a moment and pull up a side-by-side of how I added the yarn to the pots. Both of the pots were a little bit warm. They both had the same amount of acid, the same amount of dye. But what I don't know, and I'm gonna have the side-by-side real time, is if one of them went in faster than the other, or one of them had more dips or more stirring than the other, because that could also account for the difference we see here. And if it's too close for me to call by looking at how I was dipping it in, adding it to the pot, then I think what I'm going to need to do is try this again on the hawthorn base with the same color and everything, but have the pots side by side when I add the yarn, so that way I can treat it exactly the same, like I did on the wool of the Andes that I'll show next. Editing Rebecca here. I've reviewed the tapes, checked the replay, and in the pot that had no Glauber salt, I did dip the yarn in one more time. But based on my knowledge with dip dyeing and dyeing yarn in general, that is not enough, I think, to account for the difference between the two skeins that I'll talk about in the moment. And if you go back and watch that again, you'll notice that the color with the Glauber salt was not even after I had dipped and added it into the pot. But as the color struck and it stuck in there for 30 minutes, the dye sort of spread more all over the yarn, and we ended up with more even color coverage. So I do think that the Glauber salt can help get more even coverage when you have a color that's going to strike really fast. But I suppose we have to take the dye types into consideration and things like that. So I just had to say, for the record, having that side-by-side was real-time side-by-side was really, really helpful. But here we have our with Glauber salt and without. And there is unquestionably a difference. Without the Glauber salt, we've got more of the reddish hues concentrated towards the end that I presume went into the pot first. And we have a much lighter, almost like golden yellow here that I don't really see as present in this one. Over here, I did try to kind of see if I could match this up with the darkest edge. And there isn't really, now I'm thinking that this edge may be darker. There isn't really something super pronounced as being the reddish edge. And we don't have much of this kind of golden color. I think that the color overall is a lot more even, which means that maybe that's the Glauber salt doing what it's supposed to do, slowing down the absorption of some of these colors so we get something more even. Just another way to lay them out with Glauber salt, without. And so, yeah, I mean, they do feel like there's a difference to me here. On the wool of the Andes yarn, we have our no Glauber salt and yes Glauber salt. It does feel like there's a little bit more concentrated red. I do see some areas that feel a little bit more red over here. The differences are way more subtle here. It's like a little hint of something that is a bit more red that I feel on one skein more than the other, maybe. But I would say that when it comes to our wool, things are overall a lot more even. I do see some hints of green almost in our without Gorgum. I'm not sure if I see as much of that in the with. Again, I think the results are very, very subtle. And on this wool of the Andes, I tried to keep things in a situation where we would see as even color coverage as we possibly could. And this could be worth revisiting with Purple Pop, and especially on a superwash yarn where I know those blues strike so fast. It's really hard to get it to not break even when things are cold. Twisted up, the with and without Gorgum on the wool of the Andes looks even more similar. I can see a little bit of the green and some more reddish patches on both of them. And while on the hawthorn, we do have some reddish notes in our skein that had the Glauber salt. And so while on the hawthorn, there are a few more reddish patches when we had the Glauber salt, there's no question that these skeins look and feel subtly different, but it is a more visual difference. Lloyd, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly and encouraging me to play around with Glauber salt. I can't tell you how long I have had this in my stash and just hadn't used it yet. And so I can think of some other experiments to do with it, and I'm excited to try that out. So Lloyd, thank you again for being my lab partner, and I really hope you're going to love your yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and my background is that of a scientist. I have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular pharmacology, and while that research doesn't directly apply to yarn very often, the approach of designing experiments and playing around with different variables is something that is very much a part of my training. And it's always important to know that when you do an experiment, you need to have your controls there, and you may not be able to make conclusions after one experiment. But what you can do is take a look at this and think, okay, what if I change one of these other variables and use a color where I struggle with it more breaking? You know, I mentioned purple pop, but we could also use Wilton's violet icing color, a color that is notorious for breaking, and see what we end up seeing there. And that is one that tends to be a little more dramatic on non-superwash wool. So that's another way that we could play around with this to explore more. But my point here is that it's important to not be disappointed if you have a result that isn't super dramatic when you're trying to do a comparison. Because the fact that things aren't super dramatic can be something that you learn as well. For example, okay, maybe the Glauber salt didn't make a huge difference, so maybe under these circumstances it's not really worth trying. But maybe with these other kind of situations where I have a color, who knows if it'll work with like pink orchid, that strikes so fast onto yarn, maybe it'll slow it down a bit so that way when I'm dip dyeing I can get a little bit more even coverage and things will be less patchy. But there is also that other salt that they recommend to use with the pre-metallized dyes, and that's one, I forget what it is off the top of my head now, but that's something that I will need to order, hopefully the next time I place a Dharma order, so that way I can try that out. If you've reached this point in the video, please leave some color suggestions down in the comments. I'm very proud of myself for not going with a purple today, even though that would have been a good candidate. Purple is a color I reach for a lot. And while I know there are some of you who are going to say green immediately and a few other colors that I know will come up, I do appreciate color suggestions because just like I keep down experiment ideas and technique demonstrations that you suggest in the comments, I also keep track of color suggestions and combinations and try to pull from those suggestions in upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching.